There we go. So we're starting. And we're starting a new series. It's called The Lord's Day. And it's by Robert Godfrey. And it's just something that is very near and dear to his heart, I believe. I think it's something that he really thinks that we need to rethink the Lord's Day. And as I've said, and something happened this week that I've added. I've said there's two things that I think that have caused what the problems that we have in the world, in particularly in the United States, but in the world. And those two things have been abortion. And the second thing is we gave up the Sabbath. But the third thing, and this was just pointed out to me this week, is that we also have lost the Great Commission. So, and I think I just assumed this, but I think it needs to be part of this too, because if we are doing the Great Commission, these two things fall into place the way they should. So anyway, that's where we are. And so without any further ado, let's I'm going to do one thing here and get rid of this. And start the there we go. What should we think of Sunday? And that's today's book. Did you get the light? Oh, sure. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them, and all on the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy. Because of it, God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. So that's one of the, and interestingly enough, this is written in the scriptures prior to the Ten Commandments. Okay, so God actually sanctified the seventh day prior to the Ten Commandments.
Welcome. We're beginning a new study.
Our
new study is focused on the question of Sunday. What should we think about it? How should we observe it? What does the Bible have to tell us about Sunday in the New Covenant, Sunday for the church? When we look at the history of the church, one of the remarkable things is that almost all Christians, through almost all times, have worshiped on Sunday. When you think about how little the church as a whole has agreed on, that's fairly remarkable. From some of the very earliest post-New Testament records that we have, we find that Christians were worshiping on Sunday. In the epistle to Barnabas in the 2nd century, the author of that letter is concerned that too many Christians are going to the synagogue on Saturday and then to church on Sunday. And he wants Christians to stop going to the synagogue and just go to church. Similarly, some of the rabbis in the 2nd century were concerned that Christians were going to synagogue. They didn't want the Christians coming to synagogue anymore. But what's clear in even that early controversy is that Christians were worshiping in the church on Sunday. And the question then before us in this study is, why did they do that? Is it a custom that could be changed? Is it a requirement that the Lord gave his church? And even more, we might press the point, as we will as we go along, is there any relationship between Sunday worship and the fourth commandment of the Ten Commandments? Which is another way of saying, is there any relationship between Sunday and the Sabbath of the Old Covenant? And that's what we want to look at as we go along. This is a question that is important theologically, it's important historically, it's important practically, and most of all, of course, it's important biblically. What does the Bible actually have to say about this matter? But we want to look at all of these ramifications, the theology, the history, the practice, as well as the biblical teaching as we go along, so that I hope this series will not just be a kind of intellectual exercise, but we'll see how really practically important this question is and our conclusions are for the life we live as Christians, and particularly as we gather on Sunday to worship. As a historian, looking at the time in which I've lived, I would suggest that one of the greatest changes in the Christian church in the last 75 years has been Christian attitudes towards Sunday. I can remember when I was growing up, my mother talking about her experience growing up in the 1930s. For some of you, that will seem like ancient history, but it's not so very long ago. My mother growing up and saying that on Sunday, almost no stores were open. On Sunday, she went to Sunday school and then to church. And then she said the family sat around singing hymns most of Sunday afternoon. And then they went back to church. And then she went to youth group meeting after church. She actually thought it was all a bit too much, but that was her experience growing up. Not amongst the Dutch Reformed in Western Michigan, but as a Methodist in California. And I tell that story just to illustrate how much things have changed. In the 1930s on into the 1950s, almost all American Protestant churches were churches that treated Sunday as a holy day. I remember moving from California to Pennsylvania to teach at Westminster Seminary in the mid-1970s. And in the 1970s, it was still remarked that there were places in New Jersey where the parks were closed on Sunday. Kids were not allowed to go to the park and shoot hoops. That was in a Dutch Reformed community. There was another town, very famous in New Jersey in the mid-70s, where still there were regular conservative Methodist camp meetings in the summer, and that little oceanside community, midnight Saturday night, they put a chain across the only road into town, and you could not drive in or out of town on Sunday. And by the mid-70s, that was seen as somewhat peculiar, but certainly not completely crazy. Stores still in Pennsylvania would have sections where you could not shop on Sunday. They'd kind of rope off sections of the stores. There were certain things you could buy on Sunday, certain things you couldn't buy on Sunday. So the idea of Sunday as a holy day, as a separate day, as a special day, was incorporated in a significant way into American cultural life, as well as into American church life. And so one of the biggest changes of the last 75 years has been a shifting attitude towards Sunday. And this has had great implications for the culture generally. I was reading an article that described how in the 1950s, when the National Football League began to grow, there were many people in the 50s who said the National Football League will never succeed because Americans will not watch football on Sunday. It's almost impossible to think such a discussion could have taken place. Today, there are churches that have services on Super Bowl Sunday at halftime so as not to interfere with the real religious experience of Americans watching football. Things have changed dramatically. And they've changed for a variety of reasons. Some people suggest automobiles have a lot to do with that, mobility, an opportunity to do things you couldn't do before. Television certainly has a lot to do with that. Entertainment that's available that wasn't available before. The pressure of economics to be able to sell more, and therefore the pressure to be open 7 days a week. There are a lot of cultural things that have happened to mark these changes, but the changes haven't just been in the culture. The changes have been in the churches as well. Still in the 1970s, I would say almost all conservative Protestant churches in this country had Sunday morning and Sunday evening services that people were by and large expected to attend. I suspect that attendance Sunday night was in most places not quite as big as it was Sunday morning, but nonetheless, almost all conservative Protestant churches really thought that the proper Christian experience was to be in church twice on Sunday. And now we find far and wide in conservative Protestant churches today that there is no second service. That has changed dramatically in just the last 40, 50 years, maybe even a shorter time than that. And we have to ask ourselves, what's the consequence of that? Has that been good for the churches? It's fascinated me, again, as a historian, not making any judgment. I'll make judgments later. But just as a historian observing the phenomenon, many of the changes that have taken place in the last 50 years in the life of conservative Protestant churches have been defended in the name of evangelism. We will be more evangelistically successful if we make changes. And yet, what is the truth? The church in America is shrinking. The church in America is certainly far less influential than it has been in the past. The church in America seems, especially the conservative Protestant church, seems to be almost disappearing from the public arena. I've been thinking about that just in this last year of the COVID pandemic, and been struck by how from the government there has been almost no call to prayer, almost no call to reflect on what this sickness might say about our society and whether we ought to be called in any way to repentance. Now, I'm not naive enough as a historian to think that all of our earlier politicians were very serious and pious and prayer-filled people. But the character of the country required that whatever they believed personally, they had to at least tip their hat to religion and to what churches said. Today, that's disappeared. The influence of the churches has withered in our society. And all of the changes that have been made, it seems to me, made in the name of growing the church, have in fact contributed to the shrinking of the church and certainly to the shrinking of the influence of the church, and I think have contributed to the shrinking of the strength of the church internally. It's not just the impact of the church outside itself, but the reality of the church inside itself. I think the churches are less disciplined. I think the churches are less knowledgeable. When I was younger, I was often impressed by how much church-going Protestants knew about the Bible. Their Bible knowledge was amazing. And I think Bible knowledge has seriously declined in the last 20 or 30 years. And it's declined in part because we are now gathering for worship half as often, many of us. And I've used the analogy, if you were a math teacher in high school, I hope some of you are, because I could use the help. if you were a math teacher in high school and your principal came to you and said, now I want you to teach just as much math as ever, but we're giving you half as much time to do it. Would that be easy? Would it be possible? But that's what the churches have sort of done to themselves. They've given away half of their time for gathering, for teaching, for learning. And not surprisingly, part of the result is that people know less. And even the time that churches have as gathered communities, to a significant extent, a lot of that time has been given over more to entertainment than to education. Well, I'm beginning to sound old and grumpy, aren't I? I was going to just be neutral and just descriptive. But this is what's happened. This is the change we've seen. And a big part of that change has resulted from a changing attitude towards Sunday. What should we think of Sunday? Should we think of Sunday as a holy day, as a day set apart by the Lord? Should we think of Sunday as in its entirety belonging to the Lord? Clearly, the attitude that says one service on Sunday is plenty is an attitude that doesn't regard necessarily the whole day as belonging to the Lord. Now, I knew a family that only went to one service on Sunday. And they stayed home and very diligently for the rest of the day studied the scriptures and the catechism as a family. I know that's true. They really did that. But most people who are staying home Sunday afternoon and evening, I suspect, I don't have hard evidence for this, I suspect are not spending all the rest of the day studying the Bible and the catechism. I suspect a lot of them are watching football, or even more deplorably, basketball. What kind of a sport is basketball? It clearly discriminates against people who are 5'7" when they lie. So anyway, it really marks a very different attitude, doesn't it? If we say, yeah, we gather for worship in the morning and then the day is free to us to do what we want with. Is that what the Lord teaches us? Is that what the Lord calls us to? What does the Bible say about that? That's what we're going to try to get into in this class. What does the Bible say about that? But before we get to the Bible, I thought it might be useful just to spend a few minutes thinking about what the attitudes towards Sunday have been in the history of the church. And I hope you'll find that mildly interesting. And it certainly sets up the discussion that we want to have about the meaning of Sunday biblically. We want to see how the church has thought about Sunday as a kind of background then to our turning to the Scripture and looking into the Scripture about Sunday. And I think we can say that the church has had, very broadly speaking, 5 periods throughout its 2,000 years, 5 periods of attitudes towards Sunday. Now, this is painting very broadly. I'm not looking at all distinctions and all of that, but just to give us a sense of how, actually, in the history of the church, there's been significant debate about Sunday. And I want to say just a word about why that debate has taken place. In the first period of the church, the early church, the period of the church fathers, the first few hundred years of the life of the church, the general attitude was that the Sunday worship bore no relationship to the fourth commandment. That was the general teaching of the church fathers. Now, we might be inclined to pause there and say, well, if those early church fathers who had some rather close connections, at least in the early part of the early church, had close connection to the apostles, shouldn't we take very seriously what they taught? And I think that's a fair question, something we ought to think about. But it's always very important when you look at a theological position that someone has taught to ask, why did they teach that? What was the context of their teaching? What seemed to be the motivation and stimulus for that teaching? Why did the church fathers seem to make such a strong distinction between Sunday as the Lord's Day and the Jewish Sabbath? Well, the reason they made that strong distinction is because they wanted to make clear that the church was not bound by Jewish regulations. They wanted to make a sharp break between Jewish practice and Christian practice. And they made that break so strong that they basically said the teachings of the fourth commandment, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, were irrelevant to the church. They did not apply to the church. And the purpose of that, the importance of that, was to establish that the Jewish community would not control the life of the new church, that the church would not be bound by all sorts of Mosaic regulations. And as we'll see when we look into the New Testament, there were those voices in the church that wanted to bind the church to things Mosaic. And the fathers wanted to be clear that that was not true, that they were not bound to those things. So the fathers developed their attitude very much in the context of a conflict between church and synagogue, between Old Covenant and New Covenant, between the effort of how does law apply and where does it apply. So that was sort of the first period, the first attitude. These people all worshiped on Sunday. These people all stressed the importance of Sunday, but they were hesitant to draw a connection to the fourth commandment. Then when we come into the Middle Ages, and the great spokesman, the person we all turn to when we want to know what the Middle Ages thought, is Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas Aquinas, in his great work, the Summa Theologica, his summary of theology, when you see the volumes and volumes and volumes of it, it doesn't seem like much of a summary, but nonetheless, his summary of theology, he has a whole section on the Ten Commandments. And in that, he represents where a good bit of the medieval church stood. And what we see there is, I think, a more careful and thoughtful reflection on the relationship of the church to the Ten Commandments. In other words, the Middle Ages no longer felt so threatened by the synagogue. The Middle Ages no longer felt so threatened by a potential Mosaic legalism. I think they could actually stand back and with a little more distance reflect on what the Ten Commandments were really saying. And so it's intriguing that Thomas Aquinas wants to see a close connection between what we call the fourth commandment. If you go and read Thomas, as I'm sure you'll all go home and do, you'll want to do that right away, what you'll discover is that Thomas calls the fourth commandment the third commandment. The Roman Catholic Church numbers the commandments differently from the way we do. We as Protestants are inclined to say they number it differently so they won't have to think so carefully about the commandment not to make graven images. They combine what we call the first and second commandment into one commandment. And then they divide the last commandment into two commandments against coveting, because they have to come up with 10. We all have to come up with 10. So in any case, that's getting off the track. The important thing is Thomas sees the fourth commandment as still speaking to the church. Thomas sees the fourth commandment as relevant to our understanding of the Lord's Day. He distinguishes Lord's Day from Sabbath, but he says the commandment still applies to us because in the fourth commandment, speaking now from our point of reference, in the fourth commandment, there is a moral and a ceremonial element. Now, some of you may have heard that language before. We, as Reformed people, borrowed that language or continued to use that language from Thomas. There's a moral and a ceremonial element, Thomas says. The ceremonial element is the requirement to meet on the seventh day and to keep it strictly. The moral element is that there needs to be time to worship God, and that time is on the Lord's day. And I think Thomas here, we may not agree with Thomas at every point or in every particular, but I think Thomas is rightly seeing that there is continuity on the issue of time for worship between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. And he is, I think, in a less conflict-driven world, standing back and seeing more deeply into how the Ten Commandments can continue to help guide and instruct the church. So there's much of value in what Thomas is saying about the fourth commandment, but there's also a problem. And we need to pause there. And so you'll have to come back next time to see what the problem is in Thomas and the fourth commandment.
It's like a good teacher, he leaves you hanging. So you want more. I'm sorry, lights camera action.
Thank you.
All right, any comments that you have, any reactions to what you said?
Well, yeah, I've lived through it, you too, Dennis, part of the Muslim. I'm 10 years ahead of you, but Pennsylvania, you had the blue laws, and we used to have, there was 2 drugstores. And the one drugstore would all put together on Sunday, they would stay open.
Yeah.
And that was in a lot of stores. Yeah,
Yep.
that's true.
My family,
That very distinctly, because our son was sick and there's no way to do it.
yeah,
So I had to call information and say, isn't there any drugstore open? And she directed me to a 10 or 15 miles from my home.
mhm. Yeah, that was one of the things is that stores just were not open. Again, you know, I saw here, I didn't write everything that I should have. We gave Sabbath, I think we gave it away.
You know, it's interesting, it's gotten further and further because 30 years ago when I first started running a store, we couldn't sell alcohol until 1 p.m.
Yeah.
And they changed it to noon.
Mhm.
And then a couple of years ago, they changed it to 10 a.m. on Sunday.
Yeah,
So, you know, it just gets gradually.
yeah. Do you think the church has been led by the culture, or does the church lead the culture?
I don't
Yeah,
think the
by
church
culture.
leads- I don't think the church leads the culture.
Not anymore, especially.
Um,
Maybe it did.
I don't know how many of you probably recall this from your, I don't know if this happened while you were a boy in the Roman church or not, but the Roman church started to have mass on Saturday nights.
And Wednesdays, as an older boy, I used to serve
Yeah.
Wednesdays, 6:30 minutes.
Yeah, they would have mass,
Yeah.
they had masses, but they specifically started to have a mass on Saturday nights to accommodate people.
Yeah.
That was the main reason. So the Roman Catholic Church did that, and they've been doing it for years, because I was probably in high school when that started. I would think in the late 60s, and they started having that. But what has happened since then? What's happened in the Protestant church? When does the Cove have services?
Yeah, I really don't know.
They have a Saturday night service.
Yeah.
They have a Saturday night service. When we talk about what time should we worship, what time should we have our worship service? What's one of the considerations? Sometimes the consideration is we should have it earlier so people can go and do things on Sunday.
If you have two services, you'll find there's a segment of the population will come to the early.
Right,
And a segment of the
Right.
population will go to the latter.
right.
And the ones usually go to the latter have children. Because you can't get the children up, fed, dressed, and ready to be there
Yeah.
by 8:30, 9 o'clock.
And the people that go to the first service wind up going and doing things on the Sabbath.
There's a difference though with the Catholic Church, and the nuance is this. In the Catholic Church, you go to mass not to worship God in that, you have to go to mass.
Right.
You must receive the Eucharist or you have committed a mortal sin. So it's a religious obligation. So they put different masses down so you don't miss, you can miss the mass. You just have to be there for the canon. When the little bell rings, the three little bells, okay, and they consecrate the host, you must be there for the canon of the mass. You can come early or late, but you can't miss that part.
Okay.
Because that is where the grace of God is dispensed. And if you, to stay in a state of grace, you had to be at the Eucharist. I'm just saying, that's
Yeah, yeah.
the reason.
But again, what do they do? They accommodate the people
Sure they do.
because they say, well, you know, if you can't get here until that time, that's okay. And so worship is very, you know, what they actually do is very, very compressed. I think I've talked about this before. I was working in a church up in Pennsylvania when the stores decided to stay open on Sundays. And this was in 1977. And what they called the blue laws, which I'm not sure what that stood for. What they called the blue laws were that stores couldn't be open. I think even in baseball, they had to, on Saturday, I think there was a curfew on how late they could play.
And if you would go to a baseball game at Forbes Field at 6:30 Saturday night, no matter what the game is on.
Yeah.
They postponed the game.
So there were a lot of laws like that. And I remember even in my house, my folks, we were not allowed to touch a deck of cards on the Sabbath. You know, just so what happened was the church that I was working in, even though it was in the United Presbyterian Church at the time, it was a very conservative evangelical church. They gathered a number of churches together and they put together a pamphlet to tell people why the store shouldn't be open on Sunday. And that was their response to it, was to have a pamphlet that would be distributed among these churches and out in the community as to why the churches should not be, or the store should not be open on the Sabbath, on the Lord's Day. Well, what did that do? Nothing. Because the stores, you know, Marilyn's sister's husband, Gary, was working at Kmart at the time, and he basically said, no, we're not gonna make money. We won't make money initially, but we will begin to make money eventually. And now, Sunday is the biggest retail day that there is. And, you know, we will stop and get some food if we need it at Food Line up the road here. And, you know, we could have a little prayer meeting with a number of people from the church that are in there shopping. I'm hesitant to do that. I don't like to necessarily do that, but and I'm not a strict Sabbatarian as some folks would be, but I should be better at what I do. I know that I should be better at what I do. So what I think should have happened, and this is where the church tends to falter time and time again. We don't think outside the box enough. So what I think we should have done as a church, as churches, I think we should have said to those people that were in jeopardy of losing their jobs, or they just had to work on Sundays because that made their 5th day of the week and they needed that money. The church should have said to those folks, look, we'll pay your wages that day. We'll take care of you because here's a need of one of the brothers and sisters in Christ. We will help meet that need.
Yeah, but that's not, their problem was they wouldn't be able to work.
Well,
They didn't work on Sunday.
then the other piece to it was the churches should have enlisted attorneys to fight for those people.
Yeah,
And that would have had more effect on this. And society says the churches are or the stores are gonna be open. The culture says that. But the culture should not dictate to people what their faith is and what their beliefs are. And that's where the church failed their members. And so we're, now, it's not even an issue for people. Well, yeah, I'll work on Sunday.
What are you gonna do about the medical? Are you gonna stay in the patient?
No, if it's something that is like a first responder or the medical field or something like that, they need to work.
Yeah.
So
You
if
can't
it's.
walk out on a patient and say, sorry.
No, and I'm not saying that. If it's like a first responder or medical field, nurses, they need to work because they're doing something that is critical. But we're talking about stuff that's not critical, that things are not, that you don't have to do.
I had a funny story. I lived in Connecticut. And we had an ice storm before Christmas. And it closed the stores, which is pretty annoying. And so the Sunday before Christmas, they let the stores be open so that they could celebrate Christmas.
Let's see, when you get the ice storm, what my particular work was, I was the fire company. We could, 24 hours a day, we had to go because you people didn't have any fire.
Yeah, so in those situations, working on the Sabbath, working on the Lord's Day is acceptable. But that's the exception. That's the exception, not the rule.
I certainly admire and agree with Dr. Godfrey saying, but there's another little point to it. If I can't go shopping and buy food on Sunday or go to a baseball game and that, if all that's shut down, is it gonna make me say, rats, I guess I better go home and study the Bible? It has to do with legalism, okay? If I don't wanna do this on Saturday, I'm just making a counterpoint. Having all these legalistic things, okay, is not gonna force me to keep the day holy. It has to be in my heart.
But I think what he's saying is the way that it was, is things were doing. People were worshiping in their homes, they were going to church at night, they were going, there was another worship service during the day. So I don't think he's speaking in legalistic terms. I think he's speaking in how should we treat it? Not that this is the way that it is, because
No, I understand what you're saying.
I don't know where R.C. Sproul was on this exactly. I know he was somewhat of a Sabbatarian, but I also know that he was a Steelers fan. And I would suspect that he probably watched the games.
See, today's a good example where you could get into this side and that side. Okay, we got people that's going on mission trip. They're going to get in their cars this afternoon in trucks, or they're going down there, they're going to be working, they gotta put the tents up and all that stuff. But you could go, let's say, if you can go too far this way, you go too far that way. There's the thing is, how do you?
And Jesus addressed that when they were walking on the Sabbath and they stopped to
The ranges, they were cleaning.
Yeah.
They were cleaning.
And the Pharisees were like, hey, what are you doing? And Jesus basically said, hey, what did he say? Who's the Sabbath for?
Well, it's for man, not for.
Yeah.
And that's like a Sabbath day journey. I can take this many steps. If I
Right.
take one more step, I
Yeah.
committed a sin.
Right.
And that's where this legalism thing comes in.
Now, Dr. Gershner would not eat in a restaurant on a.
And that's wonderful, that's a personal thing.
And that's the thing, that's, yeah, but what we can do is we can look at some of those things and say, okay, is this something that I can apply?
The thing is that so many people are like, no, you shouldn't be working on Sunday and this is wrong.
Yeah,
And then they turn around on Sunday and go to a restaurant and the person in the restaurant's got to work.
right,
If they didn't go to the restaurants,
right,
maybe they would close.
right.
Also,
Another example is what I had with our church festival 30 years ago. Guys, he said his roof was bad. There was a nice storm or something tore out his roof off. So there was 2 or 3 elders and a couple digging. We went on Sunday and we put that roof together for that guy. So wouldn't get water go. We were working, but there again, it's like.
That's, deeds of mercy,
Right.
I guess is what we need. to
Jesus
call
was
it.
criticized because he
Yeah.
healed the guy on the Sabbath.
Yeah, right.
But
exactly.
deeds of mercy, and that's what we're, you know, if we were strict Sabbatarians, what we would be thinking is we would be doing deeds of mercy on the Sabbath. Okay, that's what we would do. We wouldn't go to the store, we wouldn't go to the ball game, we would go visit the sick. We would go minister to, you know, maybe it's just fellowshipping. You know, one of the things that happens when guys are examined for being teaching elders, pastors, they're asked about their view of what the Sabbath should look like.
Right.
And now, some people feel that you should do no recreation at all. When I was in the church back in Pittsburgh, we had softball. We actually had 2 softball teams in the church. We had lots of people. And the league would talk about playing on Sunday. And my position always was, look, I don't mind some recreation on the Sabbath, but not organized. You know, so we always would say, and we had like 2 votes because we had 2 teams. And we would always vote against that, and it would always carry because there were enough other churches that didn't want to tie those days up with softball. But that was one of the things. So there are ways that we can look at the Lord's Day and make some decisions and keep it from being legalistic. I agree with you. We need to watch that, you know, because we don't want to be legalistic, but we also want to honor what God is requiring of us. So we need, you know, so it's like you said, in the first period of time, it was the and the church fathers, they wanted to divorce the idea of the Sabbath from the Jewish community. They wanted to completely cut themselves off. Well, then the next period, as he was talking about, and we'll hear more about it next week, it was, okay, let's take a better look at this. Let's really, you know, figure this thing out. So anyway, I guess to answer this question, it's like the culture caused the change in the church's culture. Society,
If you trace this all the way back to Acts, the original church was Jewish. So why did so on Saturday, they went to temple.
right,
Okay, and they were in the temple, they were fully observant. Sunday, the first day of the week, was the day the Lord rose from the dead.
Right.
So what did they do? They gathered together in their homes. And what did they do in their homes? They shared a fellowship meal together. They listened to the apostles' teaching. They devoted themselves to prayer and they broke bread.
and they sang hymns.
And they sang hymns. So this is where the idea that the Lord's there to come from. I think, if I understand that Mr. Godfrey, Dr. Godfrey has set the boundaries of this discussion to the early church fathers.
Well,
But the
no,
genesis.
that's just this discussion.
But the genesis of Sunday was that the early church was Jewish and they still were observant. They kept the Sabbath. the Sabbath day journey, they kept all that, but they gathered together in their homes on the Lord's Day for
But-
fellowship.
But the problem that arose was the problem that we find where the other laws were coming into play.
Right.
And so it was the idea is we need to not be doing.
The Judaizers, you
Yeah.
need to be a Jew.
Right, so we need to get away from that, and that's why, and the rabbis, as he said, the rabbis wanted them out of there too, they didn't want that Christian influence in the synagogue.
Even with Dr. Godfrey, we kind of disagree a little bit when you said they would sing hymns, they would sing songs.
Well, yeah, Yeah.
Even songs.
yeah,
All right, we'll get semantics.
Yeah, right.
I could say songs exclusively.
Well, when you really get down to it, singing, well, we've tried it, it's really good to sing a song.
Oh, yeah.
The words hit, where they really hit you where it should.
Yeah, the question about that is, just to get off the track, is something that, like a mighty fortress is our God, which is based on Psalm 46. Is that acceptable as psalms? Now, in the denomination of the seminary I went to, they sang psalms exclusively. Interestingly enough, when they sang Psalm 46, the tune was to a mighty fortress is our God. So, well, we've
Luther borrowed a lot of the music from the bar songs they sang.
Yes, he did.
And he put Christian words to it.
Yeah.
Most people knew the song.
Yeah, yeah. All right. What is the predominant attitude about Sunday among Christians today? The predominant.
That's it.
Now, among
Large
Christians,
discussion.
not just us, but among Christians across the
I
board.
think they go to church because it's part of Christians, it's a cultural thing. So what do? We go to church, we have a little breakfast in the morning, we fellowship with everybody. We hear, we sing some hymns, we hear Stephen, and we go home. And we've done on Sunday obligation.
Yeah. Even like our small group that meets on Sunday nights, it's like, well, do we want to meet on Sunday nights? You know, and yet it becomes the best night for the group that we're meeting with. So, you know, it's hard. And it's like you said, I've never been in a church that had a Sunday evening. No, I take that back. At Prosperity, we did have 2 services.
Yeah.
And the thing about it was, I thought, well, you know, when I started the youth group, I was thinking, well, you know, while they're doing the worship service, I could do the youth group. You know who said no to that? It wasn't the elders. It was the kids.
Oh, the kids.
They said, we want to be in the worship service.
Oh.
So we did the worship service and we had the youth group around it. Yeah, so, but yes, we did have 2 services there. Yeah,
One of the big killers of this Sabbath is right there, is the television and the internet. I could stay home today
oh, yeah,
and I could tune in and watch the service. And then after that, I could take my credit card, go in and send my tithe electronically to church and I'm done.
mine was in on Mondays.
Pardon?
Mine was in on Mondays.
But I'm just saying
I
that,
know.
you know, there's
Yes.
no obligation. Why do I need to be? Well, it goes back to why the Christians meet on Sunday. They need fellowship and to be with one another.
That's right.
You can't get away from there, you don't feel the same, the way you sound, you're gonna get it.
There's at least one family and maybe 2 families that are not attending because they're watching Charles Stanley.
And I know the argument, the shut-ins, okay, yes, but it's too convenient. It's too convenient.
See, it's only 10:30 when the bell rang. So it's 15 minutes off.
Right.
Yeah, the bell,
Going for weeks.
the bell,
It's
yeah, but it's only 10:30.
well,
We had the internet down, there's problems that might be where it is from. But the predominant attitude is, it's almost, I hate to say this, but it's almost like the mindset of the Roman Church, the Roman Catholics. You just go to church and that's your obligation, you know. What should Sunday morning church be?
Well, it should be worship, preaching is probably the centerpiece of Sunday morning. We come to hear the word of God preached to us. And another big thing, which is why this internet drives me crazy, is fellowship. I personally need to be among everybody in the church. I need to be among you and you and you. Because during the week, a lot of things, I can feel down, protect me. On Sunday, I'm gonna be among the people.
Yep.
And that fellowship is a very important part of Sunday mornings.
Yeah, fellowship. What worship should be is us coming in and worshiping God.
And fellowship, and how was your week, Bill? It stunk. And this is all, well, let's pray for you. Let's gather around and pray for you, right? And I'm encouraged and lifted up.
Yeah, and that's what it should be about. It's glorifying God, bringing honor to Him, and coming out of our doldrums, if you will. Coming out of the doldrums that we might have been in the week, because we come in and we meet God where He's invited us to be. We're almost like guests coming in. We should be appreciative of that.
John and I can fuss throughout the week. Sometimes the fussing gets very serious. We come to church on Sunday, and when we leave, the attitude is better.
Yeah.
And we think, it was all silly.
Yeah.
You think we learn after 54 years, but we're not.
How does either the church's practice or societal influence affect your understanding of the Lord's Day? We can talk about that. Why do you think this is, that navigating what the early church fathers thought about the Sunday difficult? You were addressing that somewhat, Bill.
Why is it difficult what they
To navigate, to kind of go through what. Now, remember, the early church fathers, they're the ones within 300-400 years of the resurrection. They're after the apostolic age. Well, no, maybe not completely.
So they didn't, the commandment, they didn't.
They didn't see the commandment as being relevant
To that day and age.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what the problem was. They didn't see that commandment as being relevant, because they're wanting to move everything away from Jewishness.
That in itself on the surface is silly. Christianity does have its roots in Judaism.
Oh, yeah.
If you read the book of Hebrews and you don't understand Leviticus and Judaism, the book of Hebrews, you lose so much.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
Christ was a Jew,
But remember,
an observant Jew.
but remember, this is something that was all new to them. This is like, oh, wow, we were with this guy, for like 3 years, that we had no idea that he was going to be raised from the dead, let alone ascend. That was, we had no idea. So what do we do with that? What do we do with that? When we first come to know Christ, one of the things that we have to deal with is, what do we do with this? And here they were, what do we do with this? And that was one of the things that they were saying, what we need to do is we need to get away from. What were they getting away from?
The ceremonial and requirements of the law,
Mosaic
not
law.
the Decalogue itself.
Right, they were getting away from the Mosaic ceremonial.
Sabbath day's journey, don't do this on all this
Yeah.
stuff.
Well, that was like the big thing that went between Paul and Peter. Peter, he would live life with it, and as soon as he saw his brother Jews come, he would receive and do what they will go to this law.
It tells you something about Paul. Peter's were Ananias and Sapphira dropped dead in front of him when he chastised them. Paul just leveled both barrels at him.
Yeah. All right. Apart from the New Testament, we have testimony that Christians worshiped on the first day of the week, going back to which century?
I would argue the first century, but
Well,
I'm not sure what Dr. Godfrey's looking at.
well,
Second century.
the first century, they're considering that the apostolic age, and then
The
after
church.
that's the age of the church fathers.
So you guys think second?
I think a second. Bingo.
You have a new little.
I like the little
Star coming in here. Let me see if I can find a different symbol here. All right. Why did the church fathers not connect the Lord's Day to the fourth commandments?
To clarify, the church is not bound by Jewish regulations.
Let's see where the little star stops.
Bingo.
You get a gold star, Bob.
For a time, Christians continued to go to the synagogue in the early church.
True.
That's true.
They were Jews.
Roman Catholics combined into two commandments. I'm sorry, Roman Catholics combine into one, which two commandments that Protestants see as separate commandments?
First and second.
First and second, they combine those two so that.
The engraving images, yeah, the Catholic Church. Converted engraving images.
Yes, they are. Boy, you know, when I didn't know any better, you know, I had people in, so I'm looking at all this stuff. I get like really.
I used to kneel
Anxious.
as a little boy with my rosary in front of the statue of Mary. Pray to that statue.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've told you the story about the girl that I would witness to, and I would say to her, "You get so much more out of Mass if you knew Jesus." I'm like, "No, I know that Jesus is dead in Mass." I said, "So how can you get anything more out of it?" You know?
I had a friend who used to say, why don't they take him down off that cross?
Yeah,
You know?
yeah, because that's where they want.
I will say though, there's a flip side to that.
Yeah.
When I was always afraid that Steve would go to my office upstairs, because I got all my books and my thing. Well, when my mother died, she was Catholic, she had a beautiful crucifix that we got when I was in school hanging there. And I hung it up over the desk just in memory of her. Well, I can't tell you the number of times that I've been a bad boy. And I look at that crucifix, and what happens, I'm saying, this is what that sin cost me.
Well,
So
yeah,
it
I was
has,
just
it
gonna
had a value in it.
I was gonna
it
say,
does.
yeah.
It goes away.
It does remind you of what you did for us.
Yeah, so I agree,
Yeah.
but still,
Yeah.
As little as 75 years ago, certain cultural practices were unthinkable on Sundays. What two distinctions in the Mosaic Law did Thomas Aquinas make to underscore the enduring significance of the fourth commandment to Christians?
No, see.
See?
see,
Oh, I got one wrong.
oh no, there goes my format.
Jeez,
All right. Well,
Once again.
next week, we're going to take a look at historical and biblical reflections on this issue. So, any other comments? Anything else that you might? No. All right. Well, let's end this. And.
Lord bless our service today. Oh, it's nice to have you on holiday. Now you can sit.
Yes, I'm on
It's
vacation.
a blessing, isn't it?
Thank you.
God made you a teacher. I'm glad you're here. All good teachers love to teach and they love to sit under good teaching.
Yes,
They love
absolutely.
both aspects of that.
Absolutely.